The cold wind howled through the city streets as Daniel pulled his tattered coat tighter around himself. The once powerful businessman, who had built an empire from the ground up, was now unrecognizable. His face, usually clean-shaven and sharp, was now rough with days of unkempt stubble. His tailored suits had been replaced with old ragged clothes he had picked up from a donation center. To the world, he was just another beggar sitting on the sidewalk, blending into the forgotten corners of society. But in reality, this was all part of his plan. Daniel had spent years chasing wealth, pouring every ounce of his energy into his business. He had believed that money was the key to happiness, that success would fill the emptiness inside him. But after reaching the top, he realized how lonely the peak could be. The people around him cared only for his wealth, his status. No one truly saw him anymore. They only saw the millionaire, not the man. So, he had decided to disappear for a while, to see the world from a different perspective. He wanted to know if kindness still existed in a place where people had nothing to give. The experiment had started as curiosity. He dressed in rags, left behind his credit cards, and lived as the homeless did, sleeping under bridges, lining up at shelters for food. He had expected struggle, but he hadn't expected to stumble upon a ghost from his past. That evening, as he sat on a cold street corner, watching people pass by without a second glance, his eyes landed on a woman sitting a few feet away. She was huddled in a thin blanket, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Something about her was painfully familiar. Her long dark hair, now tangled and unkempt, framed a face that had once been radiant. Even in the dim streetlight, he recognized her. His heart clenched in his chest. It was her, Sophie, his first love, the woman he had once promised forever to, the one he had left behind in pursuit of his dreams, the one he had never truly stopped thinking about. Daniel felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath him. Sophie, the girl who had once dreamed of becoming an artist, who had laughed at the smallest things, who had filled his life with warmth, was now sitting on the streets, homeless and alone. How had this happened? What had led her here? And most importantly, did she even remember him? He wanted to go to her, to say something, but fear held him back. Would she recognize him under the dirt and worn-out clothes? Would she hate him for leaving all those years ago? He had walked away from her, choosing his ambition over love, believing he would have time to make things right one day. But now, looking at her like this, he wondered if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to steady the emotions rising inside him. He couldn't just reveal himself. Not yet. He needed to know what had happened to her first. Was she alone? Was she safe? He decided to wait and watch, to listen before making his next move. As the night deepened, fewer people walked the streets. The air grew colder, and Daniel noticed Sophie shivering. She hugged herself tighter, rubbing her hands together for warmth. He felt a pang of guilt. He had millions sitting untouched in his accounts, while the woman he once loved was struggling to survive. It felt cruel, unfair. A man walked by, glancing at Sophie, before tossing a few coins her way. She whispered a quiet, "Thank you," her voice barely audible. Daniel clenched his fists. How had life reduced her to this? Then, something even more unexpected happened. An older woman carrying a small bag of food stopped in front of Sophie. Instead of just handing her something and walking away, she crouched down and spoke to her. Sophie smiled faintly, nodding as they exchanged a few words. The woman reached into her bag and handed Sophie a sandwich and a bottle of water. "Stay safe, dear," the woman said gently, before walking away. Daniel watched as Sophie held the sandwich in her hands, staring at it for a moment before taking a small bite. He had expected her to devour it immediately, but instead, she carefully wrapped half of it back up and tucked it into her coat. Was she saving it for later? Or for someone else? His mind swirled with questions. He had lived as a beggar for a few weeks now, but he had always known he could go back to his real life whenever he wanted. Sophie, on the other hand, had no escape. This was her reality. Daniel took a deep breath. He had come here to see if kindness still existed in the world. But now, he realized he had found something far more important. His past, his regret, and maybe, just maybe, a second chance. But how would he approach her? What would he even say? And most importantly, would she forgive him? Daniel sat in silence, watching Sophie from a distance, his mind racing with thoughts. He wanted to walk over, to call her name, to let her know he was there. But something held him back. Fear, guilt, uncertainty. He had spent years believing he had made the right choice, that success would make everything worth it. But now, seeing her like this, he questioned everything. He remembered the last time he had seen her. They had been young, full of dreams. She had wanted a simple life, love, happiness, painting in a little studio filled with sunlight. He, on the other hand, had been consumed by ambition. He wanted to build something bigger, something lasting. He had convinced himself that love could wait, that he could always come back to her when the time was right. But the time had never been right. At first, they had stayed in touch, late-night calls, long messages filled with longing. But as his business grew, his time became scarce. Calls went unanswered. Messages became shorter. Eventually they stopped altogether. She had told him once, "I just need you to be here. Daniel, just be here." But he hadn't listened. He had thought she would always be there, waiting for him. And now, she was here, but not in the way he had ever imagined. Daniel pulled his coat tighter as another icy gust of wind cut through the air. He couldn't stand there forever. He had to do something. Slowly, he got up and walked toward her, making sure his steps were quiet, cautious. He didn't want to startle her. Sophie shifted slightly, rubbing her hands together. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her face had lost its glow. But there was something else there, something that struck him even deeper. Resilience. Despite everything, she was still holding on. "Hey," he said softly. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. For a brief moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Then, she gave a small, tired smile. "Hey," she replied. Daniel swallowed hard. Did she recognize him? No. There was no flicker of recognition in her gaze. To her, he was just another homeless man, another stranger on the streets. A part of him felt relief. He wasn't ready to reveal himself yet. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked. She hesitated, then gestured beside her. "It's a free world." He lowered himself onto the cold pavement, feeling the hardness of the concrete beneath him. For the first time in years, he had no idea what to say. He had stood in boardrooms, faced ruthless competitors, negotiated million-dollar deals without flinching, and yet here he was, struggling to find words. "Been out here long?" he finally asked. She let out a quiet breath. Long enough. There was something in her voice, weariness, but also acceptance. Like she had made peace with this life. He wanted to ask what had happened, how she had ended up here, but he knew better than to pry. People on the streets guarded their stories like treasures, revealing only what they chose to share. Instead, he waited, hoping she would say more. And she did. Used to have a place, a job. Life just took a turn. She gave a small, hollow laugh. Funny how fast everything can change, huh? Daniel clenched his fists, trying to push down the guilt rising inside him. He wanted to tell her that he was here, that he could help, that she didn't have to suffer anymore. But would she even accept his help? Or would she resent him for leaving in the first place? Yeah, he said quietly. It changes fast. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the city humming around them. A car horn blared in the distance. People walked by, barely sparing them a glance. "Why are you out here?" she asked suddenly, turning to look at him. The question caught him off guard. He couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. So he did what he had been doing for weeks. He lied. "Lost my way," he said simply. "Trying to figure things out." She nodded, as if she understood. And maybe she did. "Guess we're all trying to figure things out," she murmured. Daniel glanced at her hands, thin, trembling slightly from the cold. Without thinking, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the half-eaten sandwich he had saved from earlier. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. She looked at it, then at him. For a moment, he thought she might refuse. But then, she reached out and took it, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest second. "Thanks," she said, her voice softer now. He watched as she took a small bite, chewing slowly. A lump formed in his throat. This was Sophie. His. Sophie. Reduced to this, the night stretched on, and they talked. About little things. About nothing. She told him how the shelter down the street was full most nights, how the soup kitchen ran out of food sometimes. He told her about the people he had met, the small kindnesses he had seen. He didn't mention who he really was. Didn't tell her about the penthouse waiting for him, the cars, the wealth. None of that mattered right now. For the first time in years, he felt like just Daniel again. But the longer he sat there, the more he knew he couldn't leave things like this. He had come here looking for answers. But now he had found something more. A second chance. He didn't just want to walk away this time. But how could he tell her the truth? Would she hate him for the life he had built while she had struggled? Would she see his help as pity? And more importantly, did she even want his help? The thoughts swirled in his mind as the city lights flickered around them. The night felt heavy, filled with unspoken words. And then, just as he was about to say something, Sophie turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You remind me of someone," she said quietly. Daniel's breath caught. "Someone I used to know." His heart pounded in his chest. "Someone I loved." She looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. "But he left." Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. His chest ached with the weight of everything he had left unsaid. This was it. He couldn't keep pretending. He had to tell her. But just as he opened his mouth, a sudden noise cut through the moment. A commotion from the other side of the street. A man was shouting, arguing with someone. Sophie stiffened, her entire body tensing as if she recognized the voice. And then, before Daniel could ask, she grabbed his arm. "We have to go." Her voice was urgent now, filled with something he hadn't heard before. Fear. Daniel had no idea what was happening, but one thing was clear. Sophie was in danger, and he wasn't going to let her face it alone. Daniel barely had time to react before Sophie pulled him up, her grip tight around his wrist. Her face had changed, fear replacing the exhaustion in her eyes. Whatever was happening, it wasn't something new to her. She had been in this situation before. "Come on," she whispered urgently. Without hesitation, Daniel followed as she weaved through the scattered crowd on the sidewalk. He glanced over his shoulder, trying to catch a glimpse of the man she was running from. A figure stood across the street, arguing with someone else, his movements aggressive. Daniel couldn't make out his face, but he saw enough to know Sophie wanted nothing to do with him. They turned a corner, slipping into a quiet alleyway. Sophie pressed her back against the cold brick wall, catching her breath. Daniel stood beside her, his heart still racing. "Who was that?" he asked. She hesitated. Her eyes darted toward the entrance of the alley, as if making sure they hadn't been followed. Then, finally she exhaled. "His name's Rick," she said. "I used to stay with him." Daniel's stomach twisted. He didn't need details to understand. He had seen enough in the weeks he had spent on the streets to know that life for a homeless woman could be brutal. She had probably trusted this man at some point, relied on him, and now she was running from him. "He hurt you," Daniel said, more of a statement than a question. Sophie didn't answer. She didn't need to. Daniel clenched his fists. He had no right to feel protective over her after all these years, but he did. The thought of her suffering, of being trapped with someone dangerous, made his blood boil. "You don't have to go back," he said. "You can stay somewhere else, somewhere safe." She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "And where would that be? Another shelter that turns people away when it's full? Another alley?" "No," Daniel said, his voice firm. "With me." Sophie turned to him, confusion crossing her face. "What?" Daniel took a deep breath. This was it. He couldn't keep pretending. He had to tell her the truth. "I'm not who you think I am," he said. "I'm not really homeless." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you talking about? He hesitated. How could he explain it in a way that didn't sound ridiculous? "I wanted to see the world differently, to understand what it's like to have nothing. I left everything behind for a while." Sophie stared at him, trying to process his words. "I have money," he said. "A lot of it. I have a place, a real place." He swallowed. "And I want to help you." Silence stretched between them. The weight of his confession lingered in the air. He could see the storm of emotions flickering across her face. Confusion, disbelief, maybe even anger. "You're lying," she finally said, shaking her head. "Why would someone like you be out here?" "Because I was lost," he said simply. "And then I found you." Sophie looked away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. He could see her struggling, trying to decide whether to believe him. Then she let out a deep breath. "Even if it's true, I don't need saving, Daniel." Hearing her say his name sent a jolt through him. She remembered. "I'm not trying to save you," he said softly. "I just don't want to lose you again." Her eyes met his, and, for the first time, the walls around her seemed to crack. She didn't speak, but she didn't walk away either. Daniel reached into his pocket, pulling out a small key. "Come with me," he said, holding it out to her. "Just for one night, a warm bed, a hot meal. If you don't want anything after that, I'll take you wherever you want to go. No pressure." Sophie stared at the key in his hand, hesitation flickering in her eyes. She had spent so long surviving on her own, trusting no one. And now, here he was, offering her a way out. After what felt like an eternity, she reached out and took the key. Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. They walked in silence to the apartment he had rented for his experiment. Nothing grand, just a simple place, but compared to the streets, it might as well have been a palace. When they stepped inside, Sophie hesitated, standing at the doorway as if afraid she didn't belong there. Daniel walked into the kitchen, grabbing some leftover food from the fridge. "Sit," he said gently. "Eat." Slowly she moved to the couch, still gripping the key as if afraid it might disappear. She took small bites, watching him carefully. "So, you really left everything behind?" Daniel nodded. "I thought I had everything. Money, power, success. But I lost something." More important along the way, he met her eyes. "I lost you." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she set the plate down and leaned back, closing her eyes. "I never hated you, you know," she whispered. "I thought I would, but I didn't." Daniel felt something in his chest tighten. "I'm sorry, Sophie, for leaving, for not being there." She opened her eyes, looking at him. "You're here now." For the first time in years, Daniel felt something settle inside him. Maybe things wouldn't be perfect. Maybe they couldn't go back to the way they were, but they could start over. Sophie let out a small, tired laugh. "So, Mr. Millionaire," she said, "what happens now?" Daniel smiled. "Whatever you want." Sophie looked around the room, then down at the key in her hand, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change.